Good evening, Estonia. We are about to start the webinar. We're just waiting for people to log in and join, and we will be with you in about 3 minutes. So sit tight and get your questions ready because we're about to start. All right, so it is 5 p.m. in Estonia, 10 o'clock on the east coast of North America. My name is James York, and I'm glad you're all here for this webinar, and let's get started. So the very first thing that I'd like to cover is just some basic housekeeping. So everybody who is here and present, you should see a chat bar on the right side of the screen that Eero has already said hello in. If everybody can just pop something into that, say hi, let me know that you can hear us, that would be a great place to start. Okay, success. The technology is working and the gremlins are sleeping. We're off to a good start. So hi, everybody. You will notice on this platform that you have this chat space available to you, and we'll use it as needed throughout the session when we ask feedback or anything like that. However, if you have questions during the webinar itself, I would ask you to scroll down on your page, and you should see a questions section where you can ask specific questions. We will have a Q&A portion dedicated at the very end of the presentation. And if you add your questions to the dedicated questions section, we'll be able to add a bookmark on the audio stream on the replay of this webinar, which you'll all have access to by merit of having registered for this. so that you can go through and get to the answer for your specific question whenever you like, simply by clicking on the question that you've asked. So I would ask everybody to use the chat sparingly, add questions to the questions section at the bottom, and we can make this a super efficient experience for everyone. So let's dive into it. So we'll be going through the next 45 minutes or so. I'm about to introduce myself, so you actually know who I am that's speaking to you, and my co-host as well. We'll go through and compare different rankings and standings on the U.S. And Canada, because of course the purpose of this webinar is to help give you a sense for which market is right for you and your business when you're looking at North America, because they are very similar markets, but there are some important differences to be aware of, and which one is best suited for you might be a surprise. So we're hoping that this webinar helps to answer some of those questions. The disclaimer is that neither myself nor Juhani, my co-host, are attorneys or accountants. So the information that we will be giving you should not be taken as legal advice or accounting and taxation advice. We are talking and speaking from our backgrounds as business development and marketing professionals. So everything will be looked at from a very high level perspective. If you do have in-depth questions, I am very happy to help you source professionals here, and I'm sure Juhani would be happy to help you source professionals in Canada who can help you speak to those topics and answer those questions most thoroughly. We'll also share some reference links and useful information at the very end. You're very welcome to screenshot that. There will be a lot of links that are useful. And then we'll dive into the Q&A. And of course, following this webinar, if you have any questions, you're very welcome to reach out to either myself or Juhani. We're very happy to help you. So with that, let's dive into it. And it's very nice to meet all of you. So my name is James York. I'm the Director of U.S. Business and Innovation. I am on the Export Advisor team for the Trade Development Agency of Enterprise Estonia. I'm the foreign representative for EAS in New York. I have about 15 years plus of sales, marketing, and business development experience across corporates, startups, SMEs. When I first moved to Estonia in 2011, I started working with FitzMe, which subsequently went on to be acquired by Rakuten. I did independent management consulting. I ran a marketing consultancy and agency here in New York. And now I find myself a founder and entrepreneur turned public servant, and I am very happy to be available to all of you as you look towards the US and look towards expanding into this market. And I am here and happy to be of help to you however I can. And with that, I would like to introduce Juhani Eistrat, my co-host.
Hi, James, you can hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Very good. Yes. So my name is Juhani Eistrat. I have worked on both sides of the border here in North America, in Canada and the US. I have over 20 years of advertising agency experience, and that includes small, medium, and large agencies here in Canada and in the US, and also includes global leadership roles at FCB, Ogilvy and Wunderman, working specifically in the technology sector on IBM and Microsoft business, which obviously explains why I have worked in Toronto, New York City, which would be close to the headquarters of IBM, and Seattle, which is Microsoft headquarters. So my experience includes servicing US clients from a Toronto base and also servicing Canadian clients from New York and Seattle. If you'd like to move on to the next slide. So the first part of this is just looking at, very high level comparisons and looking at some rankings. And all these rankings are prepared by different companies and are really just sort of reference points. So a fairly recent ranking in terms of best countries, which was done by US News and World Report. And there is a link to this at the end as well, where you can sort of delve into it in more detail. Showed that Switzerland was the best country, Canada was second, and US was number 6. And just by way of reference, Estonia came in number 55 in that particular ranking. And in a couple of slides, I'll just talk about what specific areas that particular ranking looked at. In terms of the sort of livability side of things, Canada always comes up quite high. And obviously I'm talking from a Toronto base, and hence I have a little bit of a Canadian perspective right now. In the sort of Economist Intelligence Unit Livability Index, there are 3 Canadian cities that rank in the top 10 cities in terms of livability. And again, there's a link to that ranking at the end of the presentation, so you can go and delve into that in a bit more detail. And then in terms of ease of doing business, we've got a little bit of a flip there. Canada ranks 23 and USA number 6. And from a reference perspective, Estonia is number 18. But for starting a business, again, there's a little bit of a difference there. You've got Canada ranking number 3 and US number 55 versus Estonia being fairly consistent at number 14. Moving on to the next one. At a very high level, if you just look at these sort of the 2 markets, the easiest way to look at this, and it does actually work both from a market sizing perspective, if you're doing, projections, whatever, is using the 1 to 10 ratio for Canada to US. And you can see both from a GDP perspective and from a population perspective, it is a roughly a 1 to 10 ratio. So that's a very useful reference point to have. Going to the next slide. The overall sort of best country rankings, you can see that the different areas that the countries were ranked on. And the things perhaps to highlight there are, first of all, the entrepreneurship one, where Canada and US are sort of fairly close. The open for business one, where Canada seems to pop up a lot higher than the US for some reason, and you'd have to delve a little bit deeper into the ranking to look at that. And then the quality of life one, which, as I said, Canada rates very highly on that overall in all rankings over the past few years. And on that note, if you just go to the next slide, which references the Economist Intelligence Unit data, the livability index, the 3 Canadian cities that come up in that are Calgary, Vancouver, and Toronto. Toronto, obviously, being the largest city in Toronto in Canada. Next one, over to you, James, on the taxes one.
Thanks. And so, and just jumping into the open for business ranking a little bit. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but I think that one reason to take into account is the challenge around immigration into the U.S. But we'll look at that as we go forward through the presentation. Speaking to taxes, costs, and affordability. So generally in Europe, especially in Estonia, the corporate tax rates are much lower than in the U.S. And even in Canada as well. In the U.S., a few years ago it was significantly higher. You can see here the income the corporate income tax rate in 2017 was close to 40%, approaching, so 38.9. But we're now thankfully more competitive on that front, and they did that through looking to expand the taxable base, remove different restrictions and exemptions, and they were able to bring that down. We are now about on par with Canada, so significantly more competitive on that front. But when it comes to corporate income tax rates, you can't compare it to Estonia, where the dividend structure and the way that this is built is significantly more advantageous for business owners than it is here. So something to be aware of. Just looking at this broader kind of historical comparison, you can see in 2017 what I was referencing, where we were just through the roof here in the U.S. Between Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Canada, everybody was, somewhere in the 20s, where we were close to 40%. It was outrageous. 2018, 2019, Canada, Latin America, the U.S. were much more on par. So basically, in this hemisphere, you're gonna have corporate tax rates somewhere in the 26, 27, 28% range. And comparing it, of course, to Estonia, Canada, and the U.S., Estonia has been straight across the board at that flat 20%, and now Canada and the U.S. are about on par. So not really much of a win in either of our directions. So on this front, we're about equal. So, and Juhani, do you want to pick up from here?
Yeah, just jump onto the next slide, because the next slide was this is taken from a pitch that Toronto did to be Amazon's second HQ. Obviously, New York was also involved in that. And there's a link to that pitch document at the back of the deck too, and it provides some very useful reference points for Toronto. So it's just, this one is obviously very much Toronto skewed, and it's showing, as you'd expect in a pitch document, that Toronto has a very competitive operating cost relative to other cities in the US. And similarly, on the corporate income tax comparison there, it's it's middle of the pack too. Moving on.
Actually, let me just jump in there. Yeah. So it is worth noting as well that while New York City definitely considers itself the center of the known universe, it is an expensive place to be. So even when companies in Estonia are coming to me in my capacity of my role here with EAS, and they're looking at the U.S. and they're looking at setting up a first office, it really depends on the type of business that you're doing. It depends on where your clients are. It depends on what your goals and ambitions in this market are. And New York City, despite me being a native New Yorker and being based here out of the Consulate General, it's not always my first recommendation in terms of a city to establish your first beachhead office in this market. So if you have questions about where in the U.S. might be beneficial, depending on your particular needs, circumstances, ambitions, and interests, that's something I'm very happy to discuss with any of you in the future. So let's go to the next slide.
The next slide, yes. And on that, picking up on that note, you can see that again, this is taken from the Amazon pitch. This shows a sort of a relative cost of living in some in cities in North America, and as you can see, New York City is far and away the most expensive. And having lived in both New York City and Toronto, if you're in New York, then Toronto is really a suburb of New York. Moving on to the next one, from an access perspective, I mean, but East Coast North America, and that accounts for whether it's New York or Toronto, are both very, very well connected to the rest of the world. And another key point is that the US and Canadian economies are very, very tightly linked together, and the replacement trade agreement for NAFTA, known as USMCA, US Mexico Canada Free Trade Agreement, has now been ratified by the US Congress, and is expected to be ratified probably in the next couple of months in Canada and Mexico as well. And that is key, obviously, because it maintains the continuity of trade between these three key North American trading partners, and obviously the US is by far and away the biggest trading partner for Canada. In terms of accessibility, if you just leap to the next slide, and this works for New York as well. I mean, Toronto is literally a 1.5 hour flight from New York. So I often will take day trips to the US, whether it be New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, whatever. So very accessible from here. And you can see the times to London, and then similarly to the West Coast and also to Asia as well. Toronto and New York would both be fairly centrally located and accessible. So hand over to you for the next one, James.
Yes. So and further to that, you can almost think of, and no insult intended, but Toronto is so close to New York, it's almost as if it were northern upstate New York. And having just been there in November for Latitude 44, I can tell you firsthand that the flight time from New York City to Toronto was shorter than most of my mornings on my daily commute into the office. So it's extremely close and convenient. And obviously, the pace of life is also slower and more relaxed in Toronto. So, despite being a native New Yorker, I will say that Toronto has I would argue, has a higher quality of life if you want to have a life outside of work as well. But New York is awesome. Come to New York. I love New York. And let's look at the next slide. So this is all about immigration policy comparisons, and this is where a lot of Estonian entrepreneurs and businesses, and really any foreign entrepreneur or business hits the most stumbling blocks when they're looking at the U.S. market, because it is hard to get here. The policies have not necessarily changed in recent years. However, the implementation of the existing policies absolutely has. And we're getting more and more reports of Estonian entrepreneurs who are being turned away at the border because the border control officers mistakenly think that they're entering the country to earn money, because many entrepreneurs, when they're coming to the U.S., they're coming for business meetings, they're coming for conferences, they're coming to meet with clients, but they're not earning a dollar in this country while they are here. However, sometimes the intent of the trip can be misconstrued, misinterpreted, misunderstood, and there's an expectation at the border that you are earning money, and that's not allowed if you are not here on a work visa, which most people, when they're coming for a short visit, only have their ESTA, which is not a visa; it's just a registration. And they're
Right,
really here on a tourist visa.
James, let me just jump in there for a second. When
Mm-hmm.
you're doing day trips from Canada to US, it's obviously, it is also important not to imply that you are doing work in the US. So my standard answer to a US immigration official is, I'm going to see a client. If he says, are you doing work? No, I do the work in Canada, but I'm just going to see a client.
Exactly. So it's very important to not embellish anything, not give more information than is requested, but really just to be there, state your business. Your business should be in line with the paperwork that allows you to be here, and that should reduce any hassle that you might encounter. But speaking more broadly to the actual immigration policies, it's very interesting to note that Canada doesn't have a quota for the number of immigrants entering for work permits, whereas here in the US, we absolutely do. Most are applying for what's called an H-1B visa. So this is the most common type of employment visa that you have in the States. And the quantities are actually quite quite limited in terms of what is available versus the demand. In fact, it's almost like registration for a popular music concert. When you're buying the ticket, if you're not there waiting to buy your ticket when the doors open, they could be sold out. And the same thing happens with the H-1B applications, where very often the annual quotas for the H-1B visas are met within the first day of the annual round being open. So if you are looking towards an H-1B visa in consultation with an immigration attorney here in the U.S., be aware that you have to be snappy with it to get your application in fast enough. Excuse me. Canada also allows people to renew their status while they're in Canada, which is vastly different from what it is here in the U.S. In the U.S., the government doesn't really like what's called a status change while you're here. So if you come on a tourist visa and you're looking to then change to a work permit, or say you're here on a tourist visa and you're looking to even get a fiance visa because you want to get married to an American national. The U.S. tends to frown on that, and it can inhibit the progress with your immigration application. So it's much better to do all status changes abroad when you are home in Estonia. Absolutely the better way to do it, to reduce complications and reduce challenges. Obviously, in the U.S., we have a tracking system of who comes in and comes out. Anyone who has come through customs at any U.S. airport has experienced that process. Canada doesn't, so it's much more liberal in that respect. Once you do have a visa or a green card here in the U.S., though, you can sponsor siblings, which I was surprised to learn is not possible in Canada. But it's a bit of when theory hits practice, because while you absolutely can sponsor siblings and close relatives, so parents, for example, on a visa here in the U.S., when you are here on a visa in the U.S. Or I apologize, when you're a citizen of the U.S., you can sponsor siblings. It can take a very, very long time for it to be processed. So how practical that is if you are a sibling or a close relative of somebody who's a U.S. citizen, and you're looking at that as a potential avenue for legal entry into the U.S. And a path towards permanent residency, it's absolutely available to you. But in terms of expediency, it's not necessarily going to be your fastest option. Continuing on, and further to that, the most common way that people get permanent residence here in the U.S. Is through family connection. So if you are a U.S. citizen, permanent residence, you can petition for your immediate family members to receive green cards. As I just said, it can take a very, very long time. So if you're looking at that as a route for business purposes, probably not your smartest play, and better to go through a work visa application, which is the second most common way through employment. U.S. employers can sponsor you. That's the application for the H-1B. So when you're looking at as an Estonian entrepreneur and coming on an H-1B, then it usually requires that you have a U.S. entity that is then the employer who's sponsoring you. But there are, depending on your role in the company, depending on how you've structured it, and that's why these are questions best left for an attorney, there are different categories of visas that might be available to you depending on your particular circumstances. They all have a duration, however, on them. So that's something to be aware of. And of course, with USCIS, so the U.S. Immigration Authority, nothing is ever guaranteed. So you can be here on a visa, you can have an application in that doesn't entitle you to a right to stay. It's always at their discretion. Yeah, so let's go on to the next one. I'm going to pass this back to you, Juhani, to speak about the Canadian system.
I'll just add some color commentary to the U.S. Immigration part. When I worked in New York, initially I transferred, I think it's called an N visa, which was related to NAFTA and the North American Free Trade, which was basically a consultant's visa. And then when I transferred to another, so I was sponsored by a company to do that. And then I transferred to another company, Ogilvy, which was owned by WPP, which was a UK-based company. So there was a different kind of visa that I was able to get for working at Ogilvy. And they actually fast-tracked me for a green card, which I got probably within about 18 months, which I don't think you can do these days. And the problem is, if you move away from the US, holding onto a green card becomes more difficult, because every time you come in, they say, well, do you live in the US? Well, no, but I'm going to move back. And eventually they just take it away from you, unfortunately. But moving on to the Canadian system, it's fundamentally a points-based system. So you get points for specific, experience, education, and abilities that are deemed to be needed within the Canadian market. And this is sort of on a national scale and also on a provincial scale. But probably the most relevant one, which is relatively new, and it was piloted in 2013 and now has become, a permanent part of the immigration policy in Canada, is the Startup Visa Program. And the key to that, and for many of this audience probably is relevant, is that it requires a commitment from a designated either angel investor, VC fund, or business incubator that is listed within this program. So basically, you have to pitch yourself to one of these three groupings, get a commitment from them, and once you do that, you can pretty well fast track your way in. So that is actually quite a good option for entrepreneurs, and it's specifically targeted to getting more entrepreneurs into Canada. So moving on to the next one, just again, reference point. I mean, the largest New York markets. I mean, James is based in New York. I'm based in Toronto. There's New York, Los Angeles, Toronto, and Chicago, roughly the same size. I mean, these days, Toronto has taken over the number 3 spot in terms of size for the North American market. But again, it probably depends on how you measure the Greater Toronto and Greater Chicago area. As I mentioned earlier, it's very much a 1 to 10 rule in terms of the Canadian and US market. And that 1 to 10 rule really works quite well when you're trying to size things. And if we move on to the next couple of slides, just again, reference points. These are from the sort of Amazon pitch. Toronto is, being the largest city in in Canada is very much the sort of services center from a financial perspective, from a tech perspective. It has a very tech savvy workforce. It has a very well educated workforce. In fact, I believe that Waterloo, which is about an hour and a bit west of Toronto, Waterloo computer sciences grads, I think more computer sciences grads are hired out of Waterloo than out of Stanford for Silicon Valley, I believe is the number. So it is a very good tech hub. I won't dwell on that more than that. I mean, again, a very well-educated workforce in Toronto. Again, this is the Amazon pitch document. But moving on to the sort of the conclusions page, so we've got time for some questions as well. And arguably, these are kind of non-conclusions, really, because ultimately each business case you need to look at individually. And I don't think there's any cookie cutter answer. It's going to be a strategic business decision balanced with some lifestyle considerations and cost considerations. Personally, I've lived and worked in London, in the UK, in Toronto, in New York City, in Seattle, and they've all provided positive experience in many aspects of life there. But more recently, I've been based in Toronto, and I've found that Toronto has proved to be a very good base for setting up and servicing the UK market, for the US market. The last,
and so I'll jump in there and also give a pitch
Yeah.
for the US side. So for sure, the US is not an easy market. So anybody who is looking at the US market, similarly to any other very, very large market globally, whether that's the US, whether that's China, whether it's Germany, you have to make the commitment to really go in. It's a very difficult market to simply test the waters and see if there's opportunity here. I would say that without doubt, in 99% of circumstances, there is opportunity here. It's simply a question of going through and putting in the legwork, putting in the effort, putting in the time and financial commitment and resources to find the opportunity, and then take the most advantage of it that you possibly can. But if you're not prepared to do that, then it's not necessarily the right market for you. But I encourage you to try, because the upside potential in the U.S. is astronomical, and you can do really amazing things here. And in terms of lifestyle considerations, obviously, if we're comparing New York City and Toronto, I have to concede that Toronto probably has a higher quality of life than New York. New York is loud and dirty, and a stressful place to be on yourself as an organism, but it's also amazing and shiny and bursting with energy. If you look, however, at other locations and areas of the U.S., and where you're looking to be in this market, and to kind of be contained in the bubble that is this market, without the back and forth between New York and Canada, there are definitely other options available to you. Philadelphia, for one, is an excellent city. The population is about the same as all three Baltics combined, and everyone in the city is very open for business, very eager to have meetings, very eager for new international business and entrepreneurs. So that's an excellent place. Chicago, DC, Austin, Nashville is a growing base there. Denver. I mean, there are lots of different options. So when you're looking at the U.S., even though I am based here in New York, know that the entire country is open, and there is likely a fit for you here. It's a question of finding where that is, and I'm very happy to help you with that process. So let's now move to the reference links that Juhani kindly put together for us.
Yeah,
And
so these
pass it to you.
um, yeah, these are I mean the top sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are really sort of the soft criteria links, you know, the ease of doing business and the livability stuff, and the last two are more specifically. I think that the startup visa program is possibly one of the sort of more relevant pieces, because that actually does provide a fairly good gateway into Canada, assuming that you can sort of pitch your business idea to one of these sort of registered VCs or incubators or angel investors. And then the last one also provides a little bit more detail on some of the different options for Canadian residency and the like. Lots of info.
Yes. So please take a moment, screenshot this now while you have it. I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to open up your various apps if you're on a laptop to do that, and then we can move on, and we can go to the Q&A section. So I saw that nobody has entered questions in the questions portion of the platform. So either that means that we were tremendously thorough and you have no questions, or you were so captivated by the content that you didn't want to stop and write anything, but you actually do have lots of questions, in which case we're very happy to hear them now and try and address them, as this is going to be the all clustered together. Go ahead and pop anything that you have into the chat, and we'll just respond directly from there. So, and very important, somebody type something in the chat so I know that you're all still with us. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Aha! Is it possible to use a mic? Unfortunately, let me see here. Unfortunately, no, not on this platform. Yes, we can share the slides, but Constantine, can you type your question into the chat? Very happy to address it.
I think you share the slides, don't you, James?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll make sure that the slides are sent out to everybody who is registered here. Well, I hope that Constantine is typing his question now. Here we are. To start in the stock market, can you expand on that? Do you mean for investing in the stock market, or for doing an IPO of your company?
I'll just while he's typing, I can just say that Canada is a slightly unique stock market system, in that it has a TSX it's got a two-tiered stock market. There's the TSX Venture Exchange, which is designed for sort of more junior companies for raising capital from public markets, and then it's got the TSX, which I don't think any other country in the world. So I'm not sure that is actually your question, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that it is a unique setup.
So and Trevor, can you expand? Are you asking about if you want to take your company public? Or are you asking more just about investing in the stock markets in either Canada or the US? Okay, so so in this scenario, you are the one building the app. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Juhani, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number. I mean, I'd say it's a fairly competitive market. There are a number of those. I think both in the U.S. and both in Canada. The one that is probably most promoted and advertised these days is a company called Wealthsimple that has grown from sort of zero to a fairly significant market share. Which is better? I mean, I'm not sure I would be qualified to answer the question. Depending, I mean, there's certainly a market for trading apps in Canada. There's certainly a market for that in the US. In terms of the the tech workforce and the financial services savvy, Toronto and surrounding areas certainly it is a good spot for technical savvy and fintech savvy, and there are a lot of good fintech companies that are based in Toronto. Doesn't totally answer your question because I don't think there's a definitive answer.
Yeah, so I agree. There's not necessarily a definitive answer. In the U.S., there are lots of different similar apps that exist. One quite well-known one is called Robinhood, and they offer commission-free trading on individual apps. Then you have sometimes automated and AI-driven platforms like Acorns, where you can choose the type of portfolio strategy overall that you would like, but the trading ultimately is done by their algorithms and by their AI networks.
I think there's another aspect to that, is that the sort of financial and banking regulations
Exactly.
in the US and Canada are somewhat different, in that in Canada you have the big five national banks, plus then you have various other fintechs that are developing over the course of the last few years. Whereas in the US, you've got sort of regional, smaller banking entities. I mean, they're still of a significant size because they're covering a big chunk of the market, but the regulations and setup is a little bit different.
Yes, so that's exactly where I was going as well. Is the regulations, I think, are the biggest concerns when you're looking at developing an app or platform that makes use of the different exchanges that exist here, right? Whether it's the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. You're going to be, anytime you're trading on the U.S. side, there's going to be a mountain of regulatory considerations to take into account. So I think when looking at which market you might want to start with, one is obviously look at available market size, interest, competitors on the market, but also to do an analysis of the regulations that you would be subject to by trading on those respective exchanges through your app and your platform, and see what your tolerance is for it based on your available resources in terms of funding, manpower, etc. Constantine, did you have a question that you wanted to share in the chat, or anybody else? Here we just have one. So we're discussing markets. Let's start answering. So we were discussing markets. The USA is 13 times bigger than Canada. To extrapolate the topic on the webinar to Estonia, it would be Kohtla-Järve versus Tallinn. Which to choose? Why such a topic? So I think the reason that we look to do this is because usually when people are looking at North America from Estonia, they're looking at the US. The US, as you said, is 13 times bigger than Canada. The upside potential in terms of addressable market is significantly larger. The real goal and aspiration behind putting this program together was to make you aware of additional opportunities, and also for those companies that are looking at where to establish beachhead offices, or different options available to them as they look to enter the North American market as a whole, to really expand the awareness and add Canada to their radar, because it is an often overlooked entry point into the U.S. That can help you in your U.S. ambitions, depending on your circumstances. Juhani, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, and I'm a little bit biased on this, perhaps, because I live in Toronto now. Is that for me, you know, from a cultural perspective, Canada sort of offers, you know, North America, the benefits of North America, but it's got a little bit of a sort of a European sensibility still. And obviously, from an Estonian perspective, it's definitely got a northern sensibility. In terms of, you know, market size, if you're, you know, from Estonia coming to Canada, is still, you know, a significant market size. You're looking at, you know, 30+ million market, and then just Toronto, Greater Toronto alone, is in the region of 7 million. So that provides a pretty, you know, significant market, depending on, you know, what your, you know, what the product is, you know, what the, you know, what your target audience is, and what. So I think, you know, if I were, you know, sort of somewhat intuitively saying, I'd say that Canada is a pretty good test market, whilst there are significant differences. That Canada is potentially a pretty good test market as a stepping stone for going to the bigger Apple, the US. You know, that's my sort of intuitive feel.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, as well, if you're if you're looking for entry paths into the U.S., and you're looking at where you can get more bang for your buck, to use this expression, Canada is someplace that that can be considered, while still targeting the U.S., because your dollars, your euros will stretch further in Canada, while still having you at the U.S.'s doorstep, and accessible to your clients. So again, it's something to think about. Similarly to how if you're in Philadelphia, you have relatively convenient access to both New York and Washington D.C., but at a fraction of the cost of living and operating expenses and salaries than you would if you're in New York City, which is one of the most expensive places to be in the world.
The other thing to consider is the ease of market entry, and you know, we discussed in the various nuances, and there are complexities to this, of course, but the nuances of immigration. I mean, in theory, if you could get a startup visa for Canada, that would be a very, very good way of getting into the North American market. And I suspect that might be easier than some of the routes that you would find into the US, potentially.
Exactly. So to kind of wrap up this particular topic, just to bring some outside the box thinking to the Estonian business community in terms of how to go from where you are to where you want to be, because the path from A to Z is not always a straight line. So to Trevor's question, do you know why Robinhood is only in the US and Australia, and why not in Europe? I have absolutely no idea. It is a very good question. Best put to either the senior management, the board, or the customer service representatives at Robinhood. My guess is probably their team composition and their particular choices around go-to-market strategy.
Also, I would say that there's probably a significant factor is sort of regulatory environments too in various places. In financial sector, that becomes a huge deal as to how, you know, your market access is very much dependent on the regulatory environment for, you know, financial / banking type applications. And some countries are just going to be phenomenally more difficult to break into in that area.
Indeed. So we are okay. Quick question. Do you need to have an entity in either country to hire a person? Yes and no. So in the U.S. it depends on a lot of things. You don't necessarily need to have an entity. It can make your life easier or more complicated, depending on the perspective from which you are looking at it. Ultimately, you're going to have to report the salary that you pay to your hire in the U.S. To the IRS, so that taxes can be paid either by you as the company or by the individual. This tax burden is shared in most cases. Sometimes with international firms who hire in the U.S., but the employment agreement is with the European entity. There are different rules. I would encourage you to speak specifically with a U.S.-based tax accountant or tax attorney on this topic, as it is unfortunately outside the scope of what we can really advise on.
Yeah, just a quick addition
Yeah.
to that. From a Canadian perspective, a sort of a little bit of a sort of a way around that is to engage with some kind of partner, someone you know, someone you've done business with, or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
And if they are a Canadian resident, then you can sort of work through them. I mean, that's a sort of a little bit of a workaround for
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yes, and excellent point. So in the U.S. there are employer organizations where you can have a similar arrangement as well. So one such company is called JustWorks. So very often a company like JustWorks will have a shared employment agreement with between the company who is their client, that company's employee, and themselves, so that both entities are technically employing the same person. The the employing organization like JustWorks cannot make any employee decisions. They can't hire, they can't fire. But the benefit of partnering with them is that they can then administer all your payroll issues. So make sure that everything is reported properly, everything is filed properly. They also then open the possibility for you to have access to employee benefits, which work drastically differently here in the US than they do in Estonia. So, for example, nearly all health insurance is private, and it is the norm and custom that, although not required in certain cases, that the employer provide health insurance to the employee. So that's one route to go. Whether if you want to have, if you don't want to involve such a company or entity, and you want to have an employee here in the U.S. hired directly, and then you should speak with a tax attorney or an accountant to determine whether you want to do that.
But again, sorry, James, just the other workaround is that you actually have someone who is self-employed, and you figure out some kind of way around that, and that's a way of doing it. If someone who is is willing to to partner with you in some way, and are self-employed and they're already a resident, that's an easy way of working around.
Yes. In the U.S., this independent contractor and employee line is becoming more blurred, especially because of large players like Uber, where all the drivers are considered independent contractors. So that's sort of similar setup where the burden of tax reporting and declaring their income and all their tax responsibilities are on them. Different legislation is coming to effect. I think California is actually leading the way on that, and it's making it more complicated, more similar, in fact, to the situation that exists in the UK between employers and independent contractors. So, Kaido, so which are reliable websites in Canada and the US to check a company background? Which one are you using? So, in the US, every company needs to be registered with the Department of State, where the company is set up and operating and doing business. So every state will have a Department of State searchable database where you should be able to go and type in the name of the entity and see that they exist. That being said, there are third-party websites that claim to do this as well. There's actually an Estonian startup called Entify, previously KYC Pass, and they do KYC and background checks on companies as well. So they could prove a valuable resource for you in Estonia for checking on the status of companies globally. Further to that, if you ever have a question on a specific entity, or you are in discussions with a potential client and you're unsure if they are a legitimate entity, please reach out to me. And in my capacity and role through EAS, I can have a more thorough company background check conducted for you on a case-by-case basis. So I welcome and invite you to use me as a resource for that as well.
James, I think Dun & Bradstreet is a resource for that, isn't it, as well? Doesn't it? I mean,
yes. They tend to be quite expensive, though.
Yeah, I know, yeah, it costs money, but it has a system of background checking, and as you say, it is a subscription-based service, but that is one that is used.
Yes.
By, it's almost universal. I think it's across the US and Canada as well. So Dun & Bradstreet, every company has a Dun's number and what have you. So
exactly. So if you have a high volume of companies that you need to check on a regular basis as a result of whatever the businesses that you're running, Kaido, then Dun & Bradstreet is an option, but be aware that it's not cheap. Whereas using the databases on the different Department of States or coming to me through EAS are services that are free of charge. So, does anybody else have any questions before we wrap it up? We are just over the hour mark on this webcast. So if there are any last questions, I'd love to get them in. And if not, then I would like to thank everybody for joining. I understand that many of the confirmation emails for this webinar wound up in your spam folders. I apologize for that. I will see if we can find a workaround for that for the next one. For everybody attending and listening, I am planning another webinar coming hopefully in March. Focused on structuring your U.S. entity and knowing when it's time to jump in and set up a company here versus continuing on as an Estonian entity exporting goods or services. So I hope you all join for that. I'll make sure that information gets passed around. Which last question? So Richard, which country do you prefer to develop an app or platform? You'll have to make that determination based on the entire content of the webinar, I think. It depends on so many different factors and what your ambitions in the market are, what the app or platform is specifically that you're building, and if you'd like to discuss in more detail, I invite you to connect with me. I'm very happy to have a one-on-one call with you about that. So thank you everybody for joining. Juhani, thank you so much for co-hosting this webinar with me. It was great. And here's our contact information for everybody who would like to have it. Please make use of it. My door is open. Juhani's door is open. We are very eager to hear from you and be of help in our respective markets however we can. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.